It seems only fitting to begin this story in a Umina cafe called Ruby's. During World War I, the Staples family were real estate agents who bought and developed land at Woy Woy and also owned and developed the bulk of the land at Umina. Despite their pivotal role in land development, they only ever named one little street after a family member, Ruby Street. Before we go on, we'd better deal with the issue of the name of the town. By 1910, Woy Woy and Ettalong were towns in their own right. When the land at the beach started to be developed, it seemed no one thought there would be a town. Therefore, on many of the estates, the area was listed as Ettalong, Ocean Beach, or Ocean Beach, Woy Woy. It seems when people got off the train at Woy Woy and asked where the surf was, they were told the Ocean Beach, as opposed to Ettalong, where the water was still. The name proposed was Umina, an Aboriginal word meaning to rest or sleep. Rather appropriate for a town whose main activity was holiday making. In June 1920, that name was accepted and approved by the Postmaster General, Newcastle. The Postmaster General's department started using the name Umina Beach about 1951. However, the name Ocean Beach is still being used unofficially today. In 1951, Glenn Warneke of the Esplanade wrote that the name Umina has beauty and charm, and the name Ocean Beach would require the additional phrase via Woy Woy, and many residents are averse to being linked to Woy Woy any more than is possible.
I first came to Woy Woy about 6 weeks after I was born in 1923, because my grandmother had a house in Burge Road, and it was for Christmas, and all the family came to Nana Haynes, they were called Haynes, place for Christmas. 2 bedrooms, but everybody slept out on the open verandas around the house.
To understand what the area originally looked like, we have to go back a lot further than the 100 years that Umina has been settled. From the ocean shore to about where Everglades Country Club now stands was sandplain. In fact, the largest sandplain on the New South Wales coast. The sandplain consisted of sand dunes that ran in a northwesterly direction from the beach. These dunes were covered with low scrub, banksias, gum trees, burrawangs and tea tree. Life would have been good for the Aboriginal people who lived near the beautiful little beach. There was plentiful food from the sea, fresh water and shelter in the lee of the escarpment. There were several lagoons, creeks and a large swamp, fed by waterfalls and little streams that flowed off the escarpment, later known as Mount Ettalong. All these waterways eventually emptied into the ocean at the western end of the beach. This good life came to an end with the arrival of Europeans. When Captain Arthur Phillip and his men landed in 1788, they brought with them a number of diseases, including smallpox. By 1789, this disease was to decimate the Aboriginal population who lived in the area that was later known as the Peninsula. Due to the sand dunes, swamps and mosquitoes, initially there wasn't a great deal of white settlement near the ocean beach. In 1824, James Webb settled at Booker Bay and ran cattle on the sand plain. Around this time, Rob Davis began building ships at Blackwall using trees harvested from the area. On the 10th of August 1910, the Lands Department declared this land, ranging from the beach end of Sydney Avenue, west along the beach and returning along the creek, as a reserve. In 1913, Arthur Rickard, owner of New South Wales Realty, bought approximately 280 acres of land, which he then proceeded to subdivide into suburban building blocks. Arthur Rickard, later Sir Arthur, was known as the subdivision king of Sydney. On the 1st of January 1914, New South Wales Realty started to sell blocks of land in the Ettalong Beach estate. Although this first subdivision was put on the market in January 1914, it took 11 months for the first block to sell. This was in spite of the fact that there was 4 miles of corduroy footpath to entice prospective buyers to walk along and inspect the blocks of land. And 4 spear point pumps had been installed, one on each corner of the subdivision, so fresh water was on hand.
This street sign is one of the few remaining reminders of his involvement in the area.
What the real estate agents didn't mention was that there weren't any made roads and no land had been cleared or levelled, so that it was all undulating sand dunes. There wasn't any electricity, running water, garbage collection or sanitary service. So began the one business that has always been in existence in the 100-year history of the town, the real estate agent. The family who loomed large in the establishment of Umina is that of Charles Raymond Stanfield Staples.
From 1914 to 1920, the Staples family, Charles Sr., his wife Emma Lucy, and their sons Charles Jr. and Eric bought 80% of the land at Umina. From 1915, they began marketing the Ocean Wave Estate, the Santa Claus Estate, and the Golden Crown Estate.
The Santa Claus Estate originally sold in 1915 for £10 per block. In 1948, the land was selling for £20 a block. In 1916, the estate was advertised. Woy Woy, the most go-ahead place in Australia, the tourist's paradise. Although blocks of land were sold as parts of an estate, they were all really estates in name only. Surveyors had marked out the blocks to be sold, streets had been named, but that was about as far as it went. The Staples family threw everything into the promotion of the land. In 1914, a proposal was put forward to build a tramway from Woy Woy to Ocean Beach via Blackwall Road, McMaster's Road, Linden Street, which is now known as Trafalgar Avenue, Britannia Street, Ocean Beach Road, and then on to the foot of the mountain. It has to be noted that of the aforementioned roads, only 2 were navigable in 1914. It would take a further 4 years to connect Woy Woy and Umina by road. In 1918, they installed a telephone line to Umina so that people were able to contact the real estate agents who were stationed in the tiny settlement. The Staples family developed Ocean Beach Township Estate, Our Boys Estate, Ocean Wave Estate, and Ocean Beach City Estate, which seems to have been the crowning glory in the portfolio. To make a good impression on prospective buyers entering the estate, Staples made the avenues leading to the land extra wide. Sydney, Hobart, Adelaide, Brisbane and Melbourne avenues were all 100 foot wide as opposed to the average 60 feet wide. To enhance this impression, pine trees were planted along the avenues leading to Calypta Road, with many of these trees growing to stand 40 feet high. In the 1970s, most of these trees were removed to make way for the installation of sewerage pipes. Sadly, one of the last trees standing was removed in 2014. It had stood in Hobart Avenue for nearly 100 years, the last symbol of the Staples in Umina. Since the arrival of Arthur Rickard, along with Richardson and Wrench and the Staples family, the stage was set for a vigorous competition to be waged between the rival real estate agents as well as the previously unforeseen player, the people of Woy Woy. In 1918, Woy Woy and the Peninsula were part of Erina Shire Council, a council that encompassed the area from Hawkesbury River to north of Wyong around Catherine Hill Bay. At this time there was a battle fought out in the local newspaper for any council funding that was allocated to the peninsula. Charles Staples was the main protagonist supporting Umina, while someone using the alias Dinkum supported Woy Woy. Staples protested against council spending £1,000 on a retaining wall at Woy Woy when he thought the money should be spent on the roads in Umina. Dinkum wrote, "Woy Woy is essentially a tourist resort, and the average visitor does not care a continental tinker's curse if we never had a road. It's the water that attracts the people, and 9/10 of the tourists travel by water, and by improving the water frontages and the facilities for the travellers and visitors, the councillors are on the right track. Visitors are not concerned with the building of roads on some land jobber's estate in the sandy scrub. Dinkum also commented on Staples' assertion that soon there would be stores and hotels at the beach, like Bondi. He, Staples, omitted to mention one very important building that should be erected there. A lunatic asylum for the unfortunates that settle there. The only residents ever likely to be there were snakes, spiders and mosquitoes and a frog or two in wet weather. The end result was that a retaining wall and bars were built at Woy Woy, while the situation at Umina remained unchanged. Streets and roads were in name only, and well into the 1950s a gravel surface was only laid for the first 10 blocks or so of land in any street. In 1918, Spanish flu struck Australia, presumably brought to Australia by returning service personnel. Many Sydney-siders fled to Woy Woy hoping to escape the flu, which infected 40% of the population and caused 4,000 deaths.
Woy Woy was overrun with visitors, and soon all existing boarding houses, guest houses and homes were at maximum capacity. In 1919, Mrs Norwood made one of the first land purchases in the Ocean Beach Township estate. She built this home in Sydney Avenue, which she opened as a boarding house to help cope with the overflow of visitors to Woy Woy.
A committee was set up to try and manage the many problems arising from the Spanish flu epidemic. Charles Staples Jr., known as Jeff, was secretary, the start of his long career in public service. Following in his father's footsteps, Jeff Staples was active in several different businesses. He was a land developer, a real estate agent, and for 4 years he also ran a newspaper on the peninsula, the Woy Woy and Ocean Beach Chronicle. Jeff was elected to Erina Shire Council in 1919, and by 1921 he was council president, his wife having the honour of switching on the electricity at Gosford. Jeff continued in the newspaper business, eventually owning the Gosford Times. He was the first president of Woy Woy Shire Council and Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club, and retired as coroner after 26 years of service. Jeff served on many committees and was instrumental in having Gosford Memorial Olympic Pool built, as well as playing a big role in seeing Gosford District Hospital built. Until the mid-1920s, there wasn't any vehicular access to the peninsula. To drive from Sydney was an exercise in perseverance. Setting out from Sydney and arriving at the Hawkesbury River, it was then a matter of waiting your turn for the punt. Once across the river, you drove the winding road through Mooney Mooney, onto Carryong, and then down the hill into Gosford. It wasn't until March 1923 when Jeff Staples and 2 others drove a car from Carryong across the mountaintop and down Bulls Hill that a road to Woy Woy was seen as a real possibility. So began the battle to build the mountain road, as it was called, from Carryong to South Woy Woy. Jeff Staples and others knew that the only way the peninsula was going to prosper was if it was connected to the outside world by road. Woy Woy Council continuously worked on construction of the mountain road during the Great Depression, using council money as well as emergency relief funds. In 1935, the Main Road Department declared it a main road.
I'm here at Staples Lookout on the mountain road, overlooking the peninsula and Umina. It was constructed in the 1950s by the Woy Woy Rotary Club as a tribute to Jeff Staples' achievements.
In January 1939, construction by government relief workers commenced on the waterfront road. This road, which runs beside the railway line from Woy Woy to Coolewong, was opened in 1942. At last, there were 2 ways to drive to Woy Woy.
A postal service was established in Umina in 1920, with Mr Byfield as the postal clerk. The post office was located in Trafalgar Avenue on this site. The post office operated from a home, which was also a general store and newsagent.
Miss Ardina Jessie Locke took over the business and became the receiving post office worker on the 1st of October 1923. The status of the service was raised to an unofficial post office in 1924, and Miss Locke became the postmistress. Reflecting the times, when Jessie Locke married James Halliday Walters in 1924, he automatically became the postmaster. Jessie and James, also known as Holly, ran the post office and store until Holly's death in 1943. In August 1935, a branch of the Commonwealth Bank was opened in the post office. The front yard was turned into a mini golf course. A news agency ran at all stages, while the general store sold everything: food, cigarettes, tobacco and fishing tackle. After a number of moves in the intervening years, 2015 finds Umina Beach Post Office business once again being conducted in a small area at the rear of a shop.
When we moved here, it was an unofficial post office, and Holly Walters owned it, and he had a parrot there, and he was a wonderful talker, and the mail was delivered by Reg Burgess in a sulky, and he used to deliver the mail that way. It was an unofficial office. They used to call them unofficial offices then. They call them agents now.
The first post in Umina rode a horse to deliver mail, not to numbered houses, but houses with names. He knew where the houses named Plymouth, Waigunya, Gleneta and Valhalla were, and even knew the house with the address, the green front door and the big gum tree. Although the Staples family had installed the telephone line to Umina in 1918, houses with a phone installed were few and far between, even in the 1960s. When land first started selling at Umina in 1914, there were several ways to get to the area. People would arrive at Woy Woy railway station and catch one of the buses or taxis that met every train. Blackwall Road was the only thoroughfare that would have resembled a road. The rest of the roads were sandy bush tracks that traversed up and down sand dunes all the way to the beach. When it rained, the passengers quite often had to get out of the vehicle and push. If you liked a sea voyage, ferries travelled from Sydney to Gosford each day. The first stop on the peninsula was at Ettalong Point, near Half-Tide Rocks. Goods and passengers would be unloaded to rowing boats and taken ashore. Alternatively, passengers could disembark at the Ettalong Wharf at Ferry Road. From these points, visitors could walk along the beach to their accommodation or camping spot.
One family of 4 young men, the Warneke brothers, may have discovered the beach in this way and started camping there from 1920. All 4 brothers eventually went on to build houses on the Esplanade and West Street, and their father became the town blacksmith. One of the brothers, Glenn, nicknamed George Warneke, went on to travel the world as a newspaper correspondent and became the first editor of the Australian Women's Weekly. In his letters home, his one wish was always to return to his beloved beach and the house that he built, South Seas. By 1922, O'Neill's General Store had been built on this site on the corner of West Street and Trafalgar Avenue. This store was to go on to become a Umina institution. Not only did Mr O'Neill supply groceries from this store, he was also an agent for the Gross and Osborne real estate offices.
Another store to open in 1922 was the Up to Date store, right on the beach in between the end of Trafalgar Avenue and Norman Street. It was built and owned by Michael and Ada Green, and Mr Sapford ran his estate agency out of the building. When Ada died in the 1930s, Michael sold to Bessie Fisher. Rumour had it that during World War II, Navy corvettes escorting battleships along the Australian coast would anchor in Broken Bay while the sailors rowed ashore and visited Bessie's store, buying any lollies and goodies available. The sailors then rowed back to their ship, weighing anchor and sailing off to war. The building later became Landman's Cafe and Dutch Bakery. Bessie Fisher eventually sold the land to Gosford Shire Council. Now it forms part of the car park next to Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club. In the 1920s, Margaret and David Hawley took on a lease of a building on the corner of Bereth and West Streets, where Margaret Hawley ran a shop. 1930 saw David Hawley apply to council for a petrol pump licence. Before this, he was storing the fuel in tin cans and emptying the required amount directly into cars and motorbikes. When David was granted a licence, he erected a gravity-feed, hand-operated petrol pump on the edge of the footpath in front of his shop. In the 1930s, you could place an order for your food and haberdashery with the delivery driver from Grace Brothers Sydney, the order being delivered the following week. This practice caused great consternation amongst local retailers. However, the stores of Ocean Beach survived this competition. In 1938, one even had a neon sign erected on its roof, the latest thing in advertising. It wasn't until the late 1950s that both sides of West Street, from Springwood Avenue to Ocean Beach Road, were declared general business. Before this time, there were no restrictions on what could be built or where, be it shops, houses or factories. By 1920, there may have been 50 buildings in Umina. Of these, some were 2 or 4 room bungalows. The rest were shacks. Building regulations stated a house had to be of timber frame on piers, the external walls were to be weatherboard to window sill height, then fibro sheeting. Every house was to have a 1,000 gallon rainwater tank. Most buildings had a corrugated iron roof, and in their original plans the majority of homes had an open veranda, which was enclosed later to become sleeping quarters. Other buildings were shacks, made of corrugated iron, hessian bags, timber and burrowang fronds. Many Sydney-siders would construct a shack on their land and visit most weekends, enjoying the fishing, swimming and surfing, then pack up and return home. Some families erected tents on their blocks of land, then a spear point bore was sunk, sometimes only 5 or 6 feet into the sand before water was reached. A hand pump was attached to the top of the pipe, and hey presto, fresh cold drinking water was on hand whenever it was needed. And often it was needed not only for drinking, but also to combat bushfires.
Bushfires have been a frequent occurrence across the Australian landscape for many thousands of years. Every few years a fire would sweep across the peninsular sandplain, blackening the landscape but at the same time regenerating the bush and the undergrowth. Then, in 1887, something happened to virtually guarantee a fire every year.
The construction of the railway tunnel at South Woy Woy. Once the tunnel was opened, steam trains started spewing smoke and cinders into the air. The final part of the equation was strong winds. It took just a few cinders to land in the tinder-dry bush, and the fire, driven by the wind, raced up the hill, over the escarpment and down onto the sandplain. The only firefighting equipment the townsfolk of Umina had was bore water, fire beaters and man, woman and child power. There are newspaper reports of women working the pumps for hours on end, while a bucket brigade was formed from the pump to the face of the fire. During bushfires, the seed cones of the Banksias could catch fire, be carried by the wind, and on landing would burst into flames like an incendiary bomb. Many of the streets were lined with a build-up of dead bracken ferns and low scrub.
The draw card had always been the beach, and for the majority of the time it was an ideal place for beach goers. There were incidents of people getting into trouble in the surf, and so several men had taken on the job of patrolling the beach on a purely informal basis. With growing visitor numbers, by January 1922, a few of these men formed the Ocean Beach Woy Woy Surf Lifesaving Club.
In 1938, Woy Woy was dropped from the name, and in 1940, Broken Bay was added to stop confusion with the beach at Manly. The Broken Bay was dropped from the name in the 1970s. The first president was Jeff Staples. Under his guidance, the first clubhouse was built near the end of Ocean Beach Road. Several years later, the clubhouse was moved to the end of Norman Street.
When I joined the club, we were in the very, very old clubhouse, which was many years, I think it was, in those days it was already 20 odd years old and didn't get looked after much by the Woy Woy Council as it was then. And we reckon it would never fall over because there were so many holes in the fibro that the wind used to blow through it and didn't blow it over. But since then, of course, they built two new ones, the one we're in now and one that the Rotary Club of Woy Woy, with mainly the help of Arthur Young and myself from the Woy Woy Rotary Club and the council. We built the second club in my lifetime. This is the third one now we're in.
The New South Wales Shark Menace Commission forwarded designs of beach lookout towers to the club, and by 1930 an enlarged club and shark tower were in use. In 1932, Sir Philip Game was visiting the district to officially dedicate the War Memorial Park at Woy Woy. He then toured the area, concluding at the beach. The club pennant bearer, Jack Lurie, was presented to Sir Philip Game, while the club president, James W. Morris, and Shire president, Michael Green, looked on. James, or Jim Morris, had a colourful life before becoming the second president of Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club. At the age of 16, Jim fought in the Sudan and then spent 12 years with the Royal Marines as well as service in the Boer War. In 1914, he was amongst the first to sign up for World War I, landing on Gallipoli on Anzac Day and was in the first charge at Lone Pine. Being a professional photographer in civilian life, he sent the first photo back to Sydney of the Lonesome Pine, later to be known as the Lone Pine. Wounded 3 times at Gallipoli, he eventually returned to Australia and civilian life. In 1920, he bought several blocks of land and lived at Ettalong and Umina until 1935. He gained his bronze medallion at the age of 57 and was president of Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club from 1926 to 1932. One of the first councillors on the Woy Woy Shire Council, he was also instrumental in ensuring Ettalong Public School was built in 1928. By 1931, the Great Depression was taking its toll on the surf club's membership. Numbers slowly fell, and by the mid-1930s the club was struggling to survive. 1939 was a turning point for the Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club. The number of active members was now just 2. To keep the club going, 5 men aged from 17 to 50 qualified for their bronze medallions. As the war continued and young men signed up to the armed forces, Charlie Williams from the Surf Club started instructing the young women of the peninsula in surf lifesaving training. The ladies performed rescue squad duties, crewed surf boats and performed shark tower watches. A new clubhouse was desperately needed, but it wouldn't come to fruition until 1956, when the club was given the land to start building.
Regarding the surf club, Ocean Beach Surf Club, I became secretary in 1946 when I joined. And I was secretary till 1952, and from 1952 to 1955 I was the president as well. I'm still now, today, the senior life member of the club, still actively interested in everything they do. It's a wonderful club and I've always been very proud. It was some of the happiest times of my life when I was in this surf club. It's a wonderful club. I've got some very happy memories, particularly when I was the coach and trainer of the girls' surf club, the March Past team. They were a wonderful group of girls. But training the girls was very hard work. I enjoyed every moment of it. But I've had some very good friends, and they're still friends to this day. 60 years later, 70 years later, they're still my friends. Those of us that are still alive.
The present clubhouse stands on the footprint of the 1950s building. The surf club had many members who participated in the surf carnivals which were held every season. This carnival was held at Ocean Beach in the late 1950s, and all the Central Coast branch teams took part in the march past.
Rumblings of discontent amongst a few of the younger members of the Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club led to the formation of the Umina Surf Lifesaving Club, which was inaugurated on this site on the 8th of January 1960.
The first president was Jack Hogan, proprietor of the Ocean Beach camping area and caravan park. The original clubhouse was built in stages by club members. The first stage was completed by 1964. Both Ocean Beach and Umina clubs have gone through lean times over their history, even contemplating closing due to lack of members. But both clubs have survived and continue to provide support and safety for the public at the beach. The phenomenon of the surfing and surfboard riding hit Umina in the early 1960s. The main aim of nearly every young person's life was to get to the beach, and nothing has changed in 50 years.
And I was just over 12 when I actually started riding a surfboard, and I remember that surfboard. It was a huge hollow plank that Peter Retford had. And he said, "Come and have a go on this, John." Of course, there was no surfboard wax in those days. I came a cropper on the first two, but I was sold. That was it. It was pretty good. And ended up getting a balsa board and reshaping it and getting it glassed by Taylor's, from Taylor's boat shed in Woy Woy. Weighed a tonne after that, of course, and cost me a whole 50 quid. It was a lot of money in those days.
By 1925, there were several guest houses in Umina. The Astoria Deluxe Guest House boasted sleeping accommodation for 40, a ballroom, tennis courts, and even the most up-to-date wireless. A short walk out the front door and you were on the beach.
George Retford owned the Strathmore Guest House, which was run by his wife Isabel. Norm Hayward owned the Yaliki Guest House, later known as Seabreeze. Michael Green, who owned the Up-to-Date store, also built the Ocean Beach Hall in Trafalgar Avenue, where the Aldi car park is currently located. It was used for practically every social occasion for the first 15 years of the town. The entire community social life revolved around the surf club and the Ocean Beach Hall. Things only changed with the building of two little churches. In the beginning of the town, the residential population was just a couple of hundred people, but from the October long weekend till Easter each year, people came to the peninsula by the thousands, many of them to Umina. While this influx of visitors provided a desperately needed injection of funds, the strain on existing facilities was severe. Erina Shire Council had virtually no resources to fund the making of roads or the supply of electricity, water or sanitation, and yet the demand for these basic services was huge and increasing. Jeff Staples was full of enthusiasm to create a local government for the Woy Woy area. In 1928, his vision was realised when Woy Woy Shire Council was created. Once the new council was approved, the battle started as to what to name it. Suggestions were Burrawang, Edelong, Brisbane Water, Broken Bay and Patonga. Eventually the name Woy Woy Shire Council was settled on.
The first official meeting of the entire provisional Woy Woy Shire Council was held here at Rest Harrow, Jeff Staples' home, on the 15th of August 1928. So began an era of self-government for the peninsula. The new council was eager to connect to the electricity grid, enforce building regulations and improve the general standard of construction.
On the 23rd of December 1929, electricity was officially switched on at Woy Woy by Jeff Staples' wife, Florence. In 1929, there were 100 consumers, growing to 1,500 in 1938, ranging from Patonga to Woy Woy in the bays. The electrical engineer was very conscientious. When there was a power failure, he made sure emergency actions were taken to ensure Woy Woy and Ettalong picture theatres had power for their Saturday night sessions. In October 1942, Brisbane Water County Council was formed, merging the electrical departments of Woy Woy Shire, Erina Shire and Gosford Municipal Council. Another priority for Council was the construction of roads to the peninsula, and especially the long-awaited Mountain Road from Carryong to South Woy Woy, that would deliver more tourists and their money to the area. January 1929 saw the appointment of Mr. Leonard Webber, a returned serviceman, as the Shire engineer. Amongst his accomplishments were the building of the Mountain Road, the reclamation of swampland to build Woy Woy Oval, and the building of Main Road 349, which runs from Carryong to Pearl Beach and Patonga. Being a returned soldier, his special interest and crowning glory was the redesign of the existing War Memorial Park on the waterfront of Woy Woy. This park had been started by Erina Shire Council in 1925. The Returned Soldiers and Sailors Imperial League of Australia, later to be known as the RSL, had been formed by returned service personnel at the end of World War I. The Woy Woy Ettalong sub-branch was formed in 1927. Now the members were able to help returned service personnel and their families, as well as fulfil their ambition to create a special place of remembrance. The captured gun, as it was called, held pride of place, and picnic shelters had been built for community access. Mr. Webber had the picnic sheds moved away from the cenotaph, a sandstone gateway erected, with "Lest We Forget" chiselled on the lintel, designed garden beds that incorporated the Australian flag, with the Union Jack overlaid by the Victoria Cross.
The park was eventually walled and is now lined with individual tablets commemorating the memory of armed services personnel from the district. With over 1,400 tablets now in place, the park has now become the unique and special place that Leonard Webber envisaged in 1932.
Mr. Warnicky, the town blacksmith, was kept busy shoeing horses, making anchors for the fishermen, repairing horse buggies and doing general metal work. In the 1920s, 2 dairy farms operated in the Ocean Beach City estate. One, owned by Mr. Homan, was near Stella and Myella Roads. For the next 20 years or so, he let his cattle roam the district, which presented a bit of a problem as each cow wore a cowbell. Many a resident was kept awake at night while Homan's cows roamed through their yard. The other dairy was run by Bill and Kate Node on their acreage at the end of Calypta Road. By the 1940s, there were dairies in Australia and Watkin Avenues. Mrs. Malt ran a bullock team that was used to transport goods. Children were told to cover their ears if they happened to have to pass Mrs. Malt and a bullock team, as her language was apparently very colourful.
I've lived here since 1939. I was born in Singleton in 1932. My father and his brother Rhodes, they came and purchased the Cosy bakery at Umina, which was in Sydney Avenue. And we lived in Sydney Avenue, rented a house for about 12 months, and then we moved to West Street, where we opened the cake shop. It was owned by Jack Nunn. He had Nunn's store on the corner of Trafalgar Avenue.
By the 1960s, the bakery was owned by the Verheyens. After World War II, industry took off. In the 1940s, Brophy and Brown opened a sawmill in Albion Street, later to be owned by Mr. Truelove. Although houses had been approved by council since 1914, the area hadn't been declared residential. As a consequence, industrial works were approved by council. A cement, brick and tile factory started operating from premises located on the corner of Nelson and Springwood Streets. A tank making works, glass louver windows manufacturing and carpentry workshops were located amongst the homes. As late as 1954, a bed spring making factory was permitted in Ocean Beach Road and a plant nursery in West Street.
Eric Worrell operated his snake park and aquarium on the corner of Augusta and West Street, Umina from 1948. From 1952, he was supplying the venom of between 250 and 500 tiger snakes each month to the Department of Health, which used it to create anti-venom. The aquarium operated on the site until 1960s, when it was relocated to Wyoming.
People overseas always think of Australian animals as being koalas or kangaroos. They don't think very much about our snakes, our other reptiles, and we have the deadliest reptiles in the world.
The snakes, spiders, lizards and frogs Eric needed were supplied by the local children of Umina.
Things that I often think, how the goodness did I survive my childhood. One of them was catching lizards and snakes for Eric Worrell, who had a snake emporium at Umina. It was second nature for me to go and catch them, throw them in a hessian bag and toddle over to Eric's place in Augusta Street, I think it was. I'd end up with a couple of bob at the end of the day after walking home via the ice cream places. But one day I said to him, "This one's a funny one, Eric. It's got two heads." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, just a minute, we'll have a look."
Sometimes he had to tell the kids not to catch a certain type of snake, as the children would turn up with brown snakes and death adders.
And he shut the bag and he said, "John, that's a death adder. How did you catch that?" And I said, "Oh, just like our dad showed me, with a forked stick." And he thought for a minute and he said, "Right, I'll give you 5 bob for that one, but I don't want any more snakes or lizards."
Eric didn't want a death on his hands. Funnel webs were fair game, apparently.
From the 1920s, visiting holiday makers arriving at Woy Woy railway station were met by the drivers of local buses and taxis vying for customers. The buses and taxis were the lifeblood of Umina.
Life at the bus and taxi rank was quite often very tense. Every ride to Umina was worth 1 shilling, so the competition was great to secure passengers. Several times fights broke out between the drivers. Mainly, the arguments were pertaining to who was allowed to park where. In 1924, there was an incident that highlighted the prevailing tension. Mr. Parker, who owned the Astoria guest house, had 2 vehicles to convey passengers from the station to the guest house. One night in August 1924, his garage was firebombed. The Chara Blanc was destroyed and the other vehicle damaged. One fight between drivers ended up in court, and when an eyewitness was questioned, he stated he had only had 6 drinks at the pub, so he remembered the events very clearly. Along with Mr. Parker, there was the White Arrow Company, proprietor Mr. E.H. Beckett, providing a comfortable service that met all trains at Woy Woy, delivered mail and also provided touring and picnic parties. There also was the new motor service to Ocean Beach run by Lenihan and Lyam. By 1936, Riley Brothers, who had run a service from Woy Woy to Ettalong, purchased Mr. Parker's vehicles, as well as 4 taxi bus services that were operated by Mr. R. Weimer. With the onset of World War II, petrol rationing forced the bus companies to install charcoal burners to the buses in an attempt to keep the services running. In the early 1950s, Riley sold to Richter Brothers. By this time, the entire corner of Barrenjoey Road and West Street, where parkers had originally garaged their buses, had been turned into a bus depot. It wasn't until 1948 that Bill Remington's taxi rank was operating in West Street, Umina. The closest doctor to Umina was located at Woy Woy. The only real medical help was Nurse Prizeman, who travelled all over the peninsula to attend to her patients.
In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Sunnyside Maternity Hospital operated from this home on the corner of Coorong Street and Broken Bay Road. Here was a haven where women could have their babies and then spend a few days recuperating before returning to their families and the household chores. This hospital closed in February 1951 when the Ocean Beach Private Hospital was opened in Ocean Beach Road, Umina. Nature played a huge role in residents' lives at Umina. As well as bushfires being a cause for concern, storms also resulted in flooding and sand being blown off the beach and dunes.
The whole area of Umina had never been levelled before being developed. People built their houses either on the top of a sand dune or in the hollow at the bottom of the dune. Houses built in the hollows were quite often flooded, leaving the occupants stranded from the main road, sometimes for months on end. Frank Adams, a returned serviceman, and his wife Lillian bought a block of land in Burke Road in the 1920s and built their family home, Plymouth, named after Mrs. Adams' hometown. Frank often wrote to the council asking for something to be done about the water lying at the junction of Ocean Beach and Burke Roads. Frank and his wife were to open the Pioneer store in the front of their home in Burke Road.
Dad was born in Armidale and he joined up for the First World War and went overseas. He was wounded in France and transferred to England, and that's where he met my mum. And they were married in Plymouth in England. When Mum and Dad finished raising their family, Mum had nothing to do after my last sister was married, so she decided she'd get some bottles of drink and ice cream, a big container of ice cream, put a notice on the front fence, drinks and ice cream for sale. So that's how it started up. And then she went to the ale store in Woy Woy and she got about £50 worth of groceries and put them on the shelf in the... Dad had made a sort of shop front on the front of the house and put some groceries on the shelves, and people started coming in one by one. And then it gradually developed into a shop and they had quite a little business. Originally, that was the veranda across there, and the three boys used to sleep out on the veranda, and eventually it was closed in and come down a hallway, and then our bedroom was about here. Mum and Dad's bedroom was about there, and then there was a big long dining room there, and then Dad closed it off and made a lounge room there and dining room there, and the kitchen was out the back.
This store is still open to this day and known by everyone as the Burke Road store. From the 1920s there was plenty of choice for sport. A cycling club conducted races on a course through Umina and Ettalong. There were cricket and football competitions, both played at Woy Woy, but not on Sundays, as this wasn't permitted by council. Horse riding was popular, however in 1936 council banned horse riding on the beach. Of course, the beach provided swimming, surfing and fishing. The local surf club ran regular surf carnivals. Athletics carnivals were held on the beach by the local Progress Association. Beach fishing had always been popular, whether it was with a hand line or beach rod. There were at least 3 tennis courts just in West Street alone. With the influx of European migrants, a soccer and sports club was formed by the New Settlers League of New South Wales. In 1959, a group of people who had formed the Umina Bowling and Recreation Club started clearing the land in Melbourne Avenue for the purpose of laying the bowling greens and building a clubhouse. By the early 1960s, the greens had been formed, games were being played, and the clubhouse had been built. It wasn't all doom and gloom during the Depression years of the 1930s. People entertained themselves by going to the picture show at either Ettalong or Woy Woy. Dances were held in Ocean Beach and no less than 3 different locations every week. Euchre parties were popular and men attended smokos. Throughout the 1930s, residents complained about the condition of the streets. In 1930, the engineer reported that there was a total of 5 miles, 55 chains, or 9 kilometres, of bitumen roads in the Shire, and a further 25.5 miles, or 41 kilometres, of gradable roads. In 1940, with council still struggling to perform maintenance of roads, a ratepayer offered the council £200 at 4% interest over 3 years to be used constructing the esplanade between Barrenjoey Road and Augusta Street. The offer was accepted. One part of the population of Umina, who although poor, didn't feel deprived at all. They were the children. But there was one big plus all the children had, and that was the beach. Whether born in 1923 or 1953, the beach was the centre of life. If not at Ocean Beach or Umina, they were at the Cove or the Rocks. Many hours were spent walking on the old road to Pearl Beach to swim in the rock pool. The new council was only a few months old when the Great Depression hit. All the wonderful plans for a road network, efficient sanitary and garbage services, and a wide-ranging electricity grid came to a sudden stop. What took their place was a constant battle to provide basic services to residents, while also trying to promote the peninsula and stimulate tourism. In holiday times, local residents would vacate their houses, which were then rented out to holiday makers. For the holiday period, the residents lived in tents in their own backyard. These were desperate times. There were only 29 new dwellings erected in the entire Shire in 1932, rising to 64 in 1936. The population grew and people lived where they could, be it the camping reserve, vacant land, or even on the beach. There was another group of Umina residents who didn't have a tank or spear point pump. These were the families who lived in tents or humpies, quite often in the reserve near the beach and sometimes even on the beach. With the onset of the Great Depression, many people sought a safe, cheap place to live. Most were penniless and many were families, husbands, wives and children. One source of free drinking water was the spring that dripped into the bowl carved into the cliff face on the cliff road. The road had been built by Staples & Co, and its purpose was to join Umina with Staples' Pearl Beach estate. During the road's construction, a small bowl was chiselled into the rock face to collect the water from the spring that drifted down the cliff. The bowl on the cliff road was first used to quench the thirst of travellers and walkers to Pearl Beach in the 1920s. From then until the 1970s, people by the thousands have stopped, climbed a couple of steps to reach the bowl and had a drink of refreshing cold water. Council were gathering some income from the reserve. Boy Scouts, church groups and the Australian Labor League of Youth held camps at Easter and Christmas. At the end of 1931, there were so many unemployed people camping on the reserve, it was decided not to charge most campers. The number of unemployed men kept growing. 2 days before Christmas 1931, Council received a £50 grant from the government. This grant was used to employ 62 men for 1 day's work, so each man would have a few shillings to spend at Christmas. Conditions for the relief workers were basic. Council agreed to the relief workers' request for a shelter shed at the quarry on the mountain road. An inspector of emergency relief work stated, "At Council's discretion, it should approve morning tea for the men, provided it was made by one worker on light duties and taken to the men who must not leave their work." 3 minutes were allowed, but a general sit-down in a group was not permitted. Afternoon tea and also the practice of an organised stop-work smoker were actively discouraged, even if the men offered to make up the time. Work on the waterfront road had been in progress for 3 months when the Secretary of Relief Workers, Mr Gregson, approached Council asking for 2 water bags to be supplied for the workers. Council agreed it was a good idea, but as winter was approaching, the matter was held over until later. A major bone of contention was the building of the Council chambers at Woy Woy. Many people felt it was an unnecessary expense at the time, but Jeff Staples pushed ahead with the project, and in March 1931 the building was officially opened. In 1937 the Crown Reserve foreshore had eroded to the extent Council estimated it would take 400 to 500 unemployed workers using stone supplied from the Council quarry to remedy the situation. Apparently nothing was done. During the Great Depression, Council embarked on an ambitious program promoting tourism to the area. Pacific Productions were engaged in 1936 to make a promotional short film, Woy Woy, the Venice of Australia. The company implied it would be distributed to at least 600 cinemas throughout Australia and New Zealand. 7 months after paying for 4 additional prints to cover the distribution, the film had been shown in only 60 cinemas. Council refused to pay, but eventually, after months of arguing, agreed to pay a lesser sum than the original £144, 16 shillings and sixpence. The families who lived in Umina did what they had to survive, and many lived on whatever seafood they could catch. Families attempted to grow vegetables in the sandy soil of their yards. Chickens were kept for their eggs. When war broke out in 1939, Peninsula men and women immediately joined the armed forces. The Deputy Director of Recruitment advised Council that the minimum recruitment number for the Woy Woy Shire was 5 per month.
When the war started, Second World War, Dad's 5 brothers and him, or his 4 brothers and him went to war. Les died in Changi from dysentery. His name is up on the plaque, the memorial plaque at Pearl Beach. When they came back from the war, a lot of people were told, the older men were told, don't tell your family about what's happened here. This is what Dad told me, because they don't need to know everything that happened.
Council donated £10 towards the purchase by local governments of a Spitfire fighter aeroplane. The people of the peninsula took up a collection so HMAS Hawkesbury could buy a washing machine. The collection was so successful, when the captain of the Hawkesbury learned how much money had been raised, he changed his request from a washing machine to a refrigerator. Fuel was being reserved for the government, so a new source had to be found to power civilian vehicles. Charcoal burners were available as a fuel source, but being dirty and not very efficient, they weren't popular. Train services to Woy Woy and Gosford were reduced with the aim of conserving coal. Overcrowding was now commonplace on every train.
In 1942, the Japanese menace brought the war right to the beachfront at Umina.
Jap submarines invade Sydney Harbour. Their only victim, an old ferry boat converted to Navy use. 2 torpedoes found their mark before the invaders were blasted to the bottom. At any rate, these are 4 deadly fish that didn't get away.
With the submarine attacks on Sydney Harbour and Newcastle, it was realised how vulnerable Umina was. Umina residents could hear the guns at West Head firing at the enemy, but the thing that drew the most attention from 1942 onwards was the aerodrome. In May 1942, a reconnaissance was performed to investigate the suitability of the Woy Woy Peninsula for an aircraft landing strip. Many blocks of land were resumed by the Department of Home Security and the land was cleared. Where I'm walking was part of the area cleared. It ran 1.4 kilometres down Trafalgar Avenue from McMaster's Road to King Street. Some locals say the aerodrome was hardly used at all, whereas others say it was used for practice takeoffs and landings. Whatever its use, the resumption of land, construction and later abandonment of the airstrip by the Commonwealth Government caused many troubles for local landowners, council and residents. If you look carefully along Trafalgar Avenue, you can still find the red gravel used to make the airstrip. August 1945 saw the end of World War II, but it was to take more than 10 years before the owners of the land the aerodrome was built on regained possession of their property. The Commonwealth didn't want the aerodrome, and Gosford Municipal Council wouldn't make a decision as to whether they wanted an aerodrome or not. Finally, the landowners were given back their blocks of land. What they also received was a coating of hard-packed gravel 1 metre deep, covering every block. The children of the area had entertainment as they watched the strip being built, and then they had the excitement of aeroplanes taking off and landing. There were airmen from the USA stationed at the strip, and romances blossomed. There were weddings held in Woy Woy and Umina for several local girls who married US servicemen. If nothing else, one thing the aerodrome did was create a talking point for the following 70 years. As the population of Woy Woy grew, a sanitary service was started. Originally, the depot where the pans were emptied, washed and stored was located here on the corner of Ocean Beach Road and Gallipoli Avenue. Erina Shire Council was caught unawares by the growth of the Umina area, and it soon became apparent that the depot was located in an inappropriate place. Many residents were happy to dig a hole in their backyard and bury their night soil, as it was called. This practice would save them the cost of the service, but many people relied on bore water, which eventually would be contaminated if the burying practice continued. The need for a new, larger sanitary depot was becoming acute. In 1942, Council sought permission from the local government and health departments to locate a depot near the Waratah Patch, adjacent to Patonga Drive. There was a petition signed by the residents of Pearl Beach protesting the new location. The New South Wales Federation of Bushwalking Clubs suggested to Council that they should look at using barges to take the sewerage out to sea. That suggestion now seems absurd, but in the 1960s and 1970s, raw sewerage was being pumped into the sea off Umina Point. It wasn't until the end of 1944 that a site was selected, away from the Waratah Patch, 300 feet above the Ettamolong Swamp, so as not to pollute it, and far enough away from Pearl Beach and Patonga Drive. Along with the effort to avoid sanitary service fees was the avoidance of garbage service. Residents just didn't register with the council, implying that no one resided on the block. Garbage was being dumped on vacant land or into Brisbane water, and at low tide, tins, bottles and rubbish were revealed. The drainage problem on the peninsula was ever present. Council's reply to nearly every request for drainage or roadworks was, "No funds have been allocated in this year's budget." In 1950, Gosford Shire Council stated they couldn't do anything to relieve the situation and people shouldn't have built on the land that was prone to flooding. With the electrification of the rail line in 1960, most of the land at Umina seems to have been declared residential, with the proviso that curbing and guttering, drainage, land clearing and tar-sealed roads were part of new developments. Rumours started in 1943 regarding Woy Woy Council amalgamating with Gosford Municipal Council. In fact, the local government department had had enough of the squabbling that had gone on since 1928.
Erina Shire Council had been dismissed twice, Woy Woy once, and the same thing had nearly happened at Gosford. The time had come to make two shires, Gosford and Wyong, and so came to an end the dream of self-rule for the peninsula.
The idea, as it turned out, was doomed from the start. The Great Depression, starting within months of the inauguration of Woy Woy Shire Council, was a huge financial blow, and the knockout punch in terms of manpower and materials was World War II.
Would the new municipality of Gosford, later Gosford Shire Council, make any difference? Not much, it seems. When inquiries were made regarding the possibility of erecting nameplates for streets at Umina, the short answer from the new council was no.
One person who worked tirelessly for the residents of Umina was Walter Leslie Lloyd. Les, as he was known, was a staunch Labor man who named his house in West Street Jack Lang after the New South Wales Premier. Les became a Gosford Shire councillor, constantly working to improve the welfare and amenities of Umina and its people. He died suddenly in 1958, and this reserve next to Ocean Beach Surf Lifesaving Club was named in his honour. A long-term problem which came to a head in 1950s was a shortage of beer, pun intended. As far back as World War I, there had been restrictions on the amount of beer produced in New South Wales, and 6 o'clock closing of pubs had also been introduced at that time. Although rationing was lifted in 1946, shortages of materials and ingredients lasted well into the 1950s, and bottled beer was particularly scarce. I'm standing in front of the old pub at Woy Woy. The 1950s beer shortage saw ale being sold here and across the peninsula with a 1 shilling deposit on a midi glass. A ticketing system was even introduced whereby locals would be allocated tickets to ensure they could get a glass of the amber brew. The whole district felt the effects of the beer shortage, with pubs often being dry for days at a time. It was at about this time that the push began to open a hotel at Ocean Beach. In October 1952, Eric Riley, a bus company owner from Booker Bay, was granted a liquor licence to be used at Ocean Beach. The licence was transferred from a hotel at Yantambulla, 100 miles west of Bourke. In October 1955, the official opening was held here at the Ocean Beach Hotel, but unfortunately Mr Riley had died a few weeks earlier. His wife and 2 sons had to carry on running the business. At the same time as the Ocean Beach Hotel was under construction, members of the Riley family, who owned and operated picture theatres at Woy Woy and Ettalong, built a theatre at Ocean Beach. It was located here on the corner of Ocean Beach Road and West Street, but sadly it didn't live up to expectations. Opening just before TV started in Australia, it struggled for years, first showing movies, then eventually it served as a roller skating rink. Concerts were held in the building along with balls that were popular in the 1950s and 60s. On the 1st of December 1964, Sir Robert Menzies came to Umina to support the Liberal candidate Mr C.W. Bridges Maxwell in a by-election to be held the coming weekend. Broadcast nationally, Sir Robert gave an address to a packed audience in the Ocean Beach Picture Theatre. The plan worked, and Bridges Maxwell won by 72 votes. Today, only Cinema Paradiso screens movies on the peninsula. The permanent adult population of Umina in 1947 was approximately 750. With the return of men from war service, there were many marriages, as well as husbands returning to their wives. The result was the town playing its part in the baby boomer phenomenon. Another group who became part of the community were displaced persons and immigrants from the European war zones. Families from several different European countries settled in Umina, but by far the largest ethnic group were Dutch, and a strong and vibrant Dutch community was established. By 1960, the local doctor, builders, bakers, watchmaker and pastry chef were all European immigrants, and today many descendants of the original migrants can still be found living on the peninsula.
In 1955, a parcel of Crown land in Sydney Avenue was allocated to build a school, and by February 1956, Umina Public School was open and ready to receive its first pupils. The school comprised one weatherboard and corrugated iron roofed building of 4 classrooms, a staff room, an office and vestibule that was used as a library, as well as a storeroom and cloakroom. The schoolyard was covered in bracken ferns and burrowangs. During the first years of the school, pupils had formal exercise programs in the schoolyard. There were sports carnivals with a police escort and march past down Sydney Avenue and into the school.
Started kindergarten at Woy Woy Primary School around 1954, and 6 months later we were relocated to Umina Primary School, which had just opened. Mainly because we lived at Pearl Beach and it was a shorter journey to school. I remember Mum first taking me to Umina Primary, and that was along Sydney Avenue, and there's a whole row of lantana, and I was thinking to myself at the time, my goodness, how do we get in here? Or maybe I didn't say, oh my goodness, but I said, how do we go in here? And there was a hole in the lantana and we walked through it, and that was my first impression of Umina Primary School.
On the 23rd of January 1960, life on the peninsula changed forever. With the electrification of the rail line, a whole new world was opened up to thousands of people. Now a family could live on the peninsula while the breadwinner travelled to Sydney for work, and then the whole family could spend their leisure time at the beach on weekends. To celebrate this occasion, a day of parades, speeches and concerts was held. After the arrival of the official train at Woy Woy Station, there was a parade through Woy Woy and then on to Umina, where another street parade marched along West Street. Novelty races were held, and later in the evening a concert was held at Ettalong. Everyone who lived on the peninsula was involved in one way or another. By 1964, the pioneers of Umina had seen new roads made, electricity supplied to the whole town, and town water and a septic system were about to start. At the same time, the sense of community and the feeling of knowing everyone and helping with any cause was very prevalent. The surf club survived because of this attitude. The Umina Public School Parents and Citizens Association was a strong, vibrant group. Woy Woy Little Theatre began performing in Umina, and the Umina Country Women's Association was established from this strong sense of community. Umina Public School had trebled in size, and Woy Woy South Public School was about to open to relieve some of the pressure. West Street was changing from a residential street to a mainly commercial strip from Ocean Beach Road to Norman Street. The caravan park was slowly encroaching onto more and more of the reserve, but the beachfront of the reserve remained unspoilt. The declaration of a reserve had saved it from development and had given the people of Umina a virtually unspoilt beachfront from Sydney Avenue to the rocks at Umina Point.
This story has been of a tiny settlement, its struggles, triumphs and growth into a thriving town and community. The foundations have been laid for further developments and changes over the next 50 years. But that's a story for another time.